At the edges of night, when the last candle flame flickered, a tiny, struggling star in the vast, polished expanse of the Hall of Mirrors, and the last, lingering footsteps of a departing courtier no longer echoed through the cavernous grandeur of the state apartments, Versailles began its quiet transformation. The public palace, an elaborate stage for ceremony and spectacle, slowly, almost imperceptibly, became something else entirely. It shed its daytime skin of pomp and circumstance, revealing a quieter, more intimate core, a labyrinth of private chambers where hushed conversations replaced boisterous pronouncements, and the soft, intricate machinery of royal life hummed gently after the last of the throng had withdrawn. The very air seemed to thicken, imbued with the scent of spent beeswax, damp stone, and the faint, melancholic aroma of fading perfumes. Tonight I am your DrowZy historian, and together we shall drift through those private spaces, following the lingering scent of beeswax and old paper, where the king, a monarch burdened by the weight of a nation, shed his public face, a heavy mask of expectation and tradition. We will imagine the soft murmur of ministers whispering late into the evening, their voices barely audible above the distant creak of ancient timbers, the almost imperceptible rustle of heavy velvet drapes, and the soft scratching of a quill on parchment. For it was here, in these secluded havens, that the true decisions were forged, not in the gilded, echoing halls that dazzled the daytime visitors, but in book-lined studies, their shelves groaning under the weight of centuries of knowledge, and in candle-lit antechambers, where shadows danced like silent confidantes on tapestried walls, their woven scenes of ancient hunts and pastoral idyls seeming to come alive in the dancing light. So let us allow our minds to drift through the palace as it truly was after midnight, not the Versailles of grand tours with their prescribed routes and memorized historical snippets, nor the Versailles of booming state occasions, filled with the clamor of 1,000 voices, the clinking of glasses, and the rustle of silk. No, we seek the intimate maze of chambers where power truly coalesced, where correspondence, heavy with the fate of nations, was carefully sealed with molten wax, its crimson or black pools hardening into official pronouncements, and where the relentless business of ruling an empire continued, often in whispers and by the dim, persistent glow of a single lamp, casting long, wavering shadows across polished parquets and ornate furniture. The public palace, with its strict protocols and relentless schedule, typically closed its doors to the general throng at precisely 10 o'clock each evening. This was a critical hour known as the *grand coucher* for the king, the formal ceremony of him retiring for the night, a ritual as elaborate as his waking. But the real Versailles, the working palace, a living, breathing entity unto itself, truly came alive only after the last courtier had departed, leaving behind a profound stillness that was almost palpable. The air, once thick with the exhalations of hundreds of people, suddenly felt lighter, cooler, as if the very stones were exhaling too. Imagine, if you will, the sheer weight of silence that descended upon those vast halls once the last carriage wheels had rumbled away into the darkness, leaving only the distant chirping of crickets from the gardens and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was during these quiet hours that the true pulse of the monarchy could be felt, a slow, deliberate beat echoing through the private apartments. It was a time when the king, having endured the endless public gaze, could finally shed the heavy brocade and diamond-encrusted buttons of his ceremonial attire, retreating into smaller, less ostentatious rooms. Here he would often work late, sometimes dictating letters to his secretaries in a low, even tone, the only sounds being the scratching of pens and the turning of pages. It is said that even the king's personal valets, accustomed to his nocturnal habits, would often find themselves falling asleep in antechambers, only to be roused by a soft cough or the distant shuffle of the royal slippers. One peculiar custom often observed during these late-night sessions was the placement of a small, unlit lantern outside the king's private study. Its presence, even unilluminated, was a silent signal to courtiers that he was still engaged in affairs of state, a subtle barrier against any untimely interruption. Beyond the grandeur of the ceremonial bedchamber, where the sun's first rays were permitted to touch only the most favored courtiers, lay a series of rooms the public never truly saw. These were the king's private sanctums, a hushed world tucked away from the ceaseless clamor of court life. It was here in his actual study that the true work of an empire unfolded, far from the gilded gaze of the aristocracy. Maps of distant campaigns, unfurled to their full parchment crisp extent, spread across the polished mahogany tables, their edges often weighted down by heavy, brass-bound tomes. Diplomatic pouches, their seals still intact and bearing the faint, dusty scent of travel, arrived at all hours, their contents whispering secrets from across the continent. The soft rustle of aged paper, the quiet thud of a leather-bound book being moved, these were the dominant sounds, a counterpoint to the distant, muffled strains of laughter and music from the state rooms. Louis Roman XIV, a monarch whose very existence was a performance, had designed these particular spaces not for display but for an almost brutal efficiency. The walls were clad in unadorned oak panels, their grain a quiet testament to enduring strength, rather than the shimmering, reflective gilt that dominated much of Versailles. One could almost feel the cool, smooth wood beneath a tentative touch, a stark contrast to the rough, embroidered tapestries elsewhere. Practical, oil-fed lamps, their wicks trimmed to emit a steady, focused glow, replaced the dazzling, yet often impractical crystal chandeliers of the state rooms. The air, faintly smoky from the lamps and the hearth, carried the subtle scent of beeswax and old paper, a smell of serious endeavor, and the shelves, reaching high towards the shadowed ceiling, were lined not with decorative, leather-bound volumes meant for show, but with weighty ledgers, their pages filled with the meticulous accounting of a kingdom. These were not the poetic verses of Racine, but the hard numbers of grain yields and tax revenues, the very sinews of power. By the stroke of midnight, when the last strains of the evening's formal entertainments had faded into the vast, echoing corridors, and the last courtier had bowed their weary farewell, the king would often retreat to these rooms. His journey was not towards the opulent golden bed where the morning levies those elaborate rituals of waking, were performed for an eager audience. Instead, he sought the quiet solitude of a simple writing desk, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of labor. Here, in the soft pool of lamplight, he would review the detailed reports dispatched by colonial governors, their dispatches often smelling faintly of sea salt and exotic spices, carrying echoes of distant suns and unfamiliar lands. He would pore over intelligence summaries filtering in from the Dutch border, deciphering the subtle shifts in European power, the delicate dance of alliances and rivalries. And with a quill, its feather whispering softly across the vellum, a faint scratching sound in the deep stillness, he would draft instructions that, after weeks of arduous travel by horse and by ship, would reach the distant corners of his sprawling empire, shaping destinies with a few strokes of ink. The study held what truly mattered, the tangible instruments of absolute power. There was the constant stream of correspondence with military engineers, their designs for new fortresses along contested frontiers sketched with precise, almost delicate lines hinting at future conflicts. There were the often grim reports from tax collectors in remote provinces, detailing harvests and hardships, the quiet struggles of a populace upon whose labor the empire rested. And tucked among the official documents were the more personal, yet no less significant, letters from his brother Philippe Monsieur residing at St. Cloud, their handwriting a familiar comfort in the starkness of duty, a small human connection in a world of weighty decisions. Here were not the scepters and crowns, the visible tokens of majesty, but the more potent practical tools, the ever-present inkwell, its dark liquid reflecting the lamplight, the delicate yet resolute sealing wax pressed with a decisive gesture, and the meticulously maintained files, each document a thread in the vast tapestry of his reign, a silent chronicle of an age. It was a place where the grandeur of monarchy gave way to its grinding, administrative reality. On those deep winter nights, when a thick, damp fog would roll in from the expansive gardens of Versailles, its tendrils creeping silently around the palace, obscuring the grand statuary and the ornamental lakes, and the vast edifice grew cold and still, a small yet fiercely burning fire would crackle in the study's hearth. Its warmth was a solitary comfort against the pervasive chill, a small island of heat in the cavernous palace. The king, a figure often weary but always resolute, would work by its flickering light, the shadows dancing softly around the room, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. He would read reports that would never, under any circumstance, appear in the public record, their contents too sensitive, too dangerous for common ears, hushed secrets that could alter the course of nations. He would make decisions that, though recorded only in cipher or coded language, a secret language known only to a trusted few, would ultimately shape the fate of millions of his subjects, their lives irrevocably altered by a quiet decree made in the dead of night, far from the public gaze. The desk itself, a sturdy piece of craftsmanship, told myriad stories in its subtle imperfections. There were the indelible ink stains, dark blooms on the wood, souvenirs of hurried signatures and urgent decrees, each a ghost of a decision made. Fine scratches, almost invisible unless caught by the firelight, were left by the points of compasses used to measure distances on campaign maps, tracing the paths of armies yet to march, silent predictions of future battles. And tucked within its cleverly concealed compartments were small personal seals, not the grand, ornate seal of state, but private marks, each with its own distinct emblem used for family correspondence and the most confidential of orders, a quiet paradox in a life lived so publicly. One particular custom, rarely spoken of outside the most intimate circles, involved a small carved wooden owl, its eyes made of polished jet, which the Sun King would place upon a freshly sealed letter intended for his most trusted minister. The owl was a signal that the letter contained not merely official instructions, but a personal plea, a moment of vulnerability, or a question requiring the utmost discretion, a tiny, silent messenger of a king's inner world. One might wonder what lost dispatch, what forgotten plea might still be sealed away in one of those hidden crevices, a silent testament to a king's private anxieties, forever waiting to be discovered. Adjacent to the king's study, tucked away from the grander, more public areas of the palace, lay a smaller, more discreet chamber. This was not the bustling antechamber where courtiers in their finest silks would jockey for position, their whispers and polite coughs filling the daylight hours. No, this was the minister's waiting chamber, a space built for a different kind of audience, a different kind of power. It was a room designed for quiet, for contemplation, and for the weighty matters that could not bear the scrutiny of the sun. The air here was always a little stiller, the sounds a little more muffled, as if the very walls absorbed the clamor of the world outside. The chamber itself was unassuming. Plush, upholstered chairs, perhaps a deep crimson or a muted forest green, were arranged for comfort, not display. Their velvet nap, even in the dim light, seemed to absorb sound, contributing to the room's hushed atmosphere. A single sturdy table, likely of polished oak or dark walnut. Deep within the palace, where shadows lengthened and silence often reigned, nestled beside the king's own study, was a space so unassuming, so deliberately unremarkable, that most courtiers would have passed it by without a second glance. This was the private secretary's alcove, a narrow chamber barely more than a nook carved into the thick, ancient stone walls. It was accessible only through a discreet, almost hidden door within the monarch's inner sanctum, a portal to the true engine room of power. And it was here, in this quiet, almost reverential space, that the true whispered currents of power flowed, unseen by the glittering court, unheard by the bustling city beyond the palace walls. Here, the most trusted member of the royal household conducted his intricate dance with shadows. His name, a mere whisper in the vast, echoing halls of history, rarely appeared in the gilded court records. This man, a phantom in the annals of state, was the keeper of secrets, the silent architect of policies too delicate, too dangerous for public scrutiny. He managed correspondence that, if ever exposed through formal channels, could unravel alliances, ignite rebellions, or plunge kingdoms into economic ruin. He was the king's shadow, his memory, his silent voice, working tirelessly in the dim light. The air in the alcove, even in the brightest hours of the day, seemed perpetually dim, thick with the scent of aged parchment, a subtle, earthy smell of old paper and forgotten words. There was also the sweet, faint aroma of beeswax used to seal the most sensitive letters, and a faint, metallic tang of iron from the inkwells, a reminder of the permanent marks made by his pen. His desk, a sturdy, unadorned oak slab, its surface worn smooth by countless hours of quiet labor, was a silent witness to the hidden paperwork of absolute rule. It groaned under the weight of meticulously organized chaos. Stacks of coded messages, their cryptic symbols hinting at intrigues in distant capitals, each cipher a carefully constructed puzzle meant to protect a fragile truth. There were reports, often damning, from governors in far-flung colonies, their pages detailing the simmering discontent of populations on the brink of rebellion, their words often stark and devoid of the usual courtly pleasantries. And then, most sensitive of all, were the private assessments of generals, men whose public reputations shone like polished armor, yet whose private files exposed a dangerous tapestry of military incompetence or outright corruption. Each document, a fragile thread in the king's vast web of influence, demanded an unwavering, almost meditative focus, as if the very stability of the realm rested on his calm scrutiny. The secretary's handwriting, a precise, almost elegant script, was the ghost in the machine of state. It appeared on documents that would never, under any circumstance, see the official archives, never be bound in leather or stamped with the royal seal. These were the true instruments of power, orders to move troops, penned without formal declarations of war, subtly shifting the balance of power on a chessboard of nations. There were instructions to colonial administrators, not for public consumption, but for the ruthless suppression of unrest, their words veiled in euphemisms yet chilling in their intent, each directive a potential spark for a wider conflagration. And perhaps most surprisingly, agreements with foreign merchants, shadowy figures who provided goods the crown desperately needed but could not, for reasons of optics or policy, publicly purchase, their names never to be uttered in polite society. These documents, ephemeral as they seemed, were the sinews of empire, binding together disparate elements into a fragile, powerful whole. As dusk settled over the palace, painting the alcove in deeper shades of grey, the secretary worked by the flickering golden glow of candlelight. The soft scratching of his quill was often the only sound, a counterpoint to the hushed rustle of papers, a rhythmic whisper in the profound quiet. He meticulously decoded messages that arrived, often late at night, by private courier, their missives smelling of horse and distant lands, carrying the faint scent of adventure and danger. He translated diplomatic correspondence, often laden with obscure metaphors and veiled threats, into language the king could quickly grasp, devoid of ambiguity, distilling complex geopolitical maneuvers into clear, actionable intelligence. His filing systems were a marvel of compartmentalization, one for official records, pristine and ready for any future historian, should they ever be allowed to see them, a facade of transparency. Another, far more robust, for sensitive materials, locked away in a sturdy cabinet, its key always close at hand. And a third, a terrifyingly efficient system, for documents so dangerous, so utterly compromising that they were destroyed immediately after being read, their ashes a testament to their fleeting, yet potent, power scattered perhaps into a small, lead-lined pot kept specifically for such obliterations. His most delicate task, one that required the wisdom of a diplomat and the patience of a saint, was managing the king's private correspondence with family members. These were not mere personal letters, they were interwoven with the intricate tapestry of European politics. Letters arrived from the king's cousin in Madrid, her words often laced with thinly veiled requests for military aid or political favor, each phrase weighted with dynastic expectations. His sister-in-law in Bavaria, a formidable woman, penned missives that hinted at dynastic ambitions and alliances that could shift the continental balance, her elegant script concealing formidable political will. And from his nephew in England, letters spoke of marriages, territories, and the delicate dance between familial affection and burgeoning rivalries, a constant negotiation between blood ties and national interest. Each letter required careful, almost surgical handling, the fragile threads of family affection balanced precariously against the unyielding demands of state interests. Personal loyalty weighed constantly against the cold, hard calculus of imperial necessity. The secretary was often left with the quiet, unsettling question of whether these intimate exchanges were truly expressions of kinship, or merely another layer of political maneuvering, disguised by the familiar hand of a loved one. The very act of deciphering the true intent behind a seemingly innocuous phrase, a casual mention of a hunting trip or a new gown, was a constant, low-level anxiety. The alcove itself was a study in austere functionality. There were no decorative objects, no tapestries or gilded frames to distract, only the bare stone and the quiet hum of purpose. Only the essential tools of confidential administration, multiple inkwells each containing a different hue or specific chemical composition for various types of correspondence, some for official directives, their color a deep, commanding black, others for coded messages, perhaps a faint blue that faded with time, and one perhaps for the king's most private thoughts, a subtle sepia. Sealing materials of various colors and consistencies lay ready for use, each signifying a different level of security or a specific recipient, a silent language of importance. And in the corner, almost part of the wall itself, stood a small, heavy safe, its iron door bearing no ornamentation, only the promise of absolute security, where the most sensitive documents waited in silent anticipation for the king's personal attention. It was a space where the weight of empire settled, quietly on the shoulders of one man, forever unseen, forever unheard, yet utterly indispensable. And though his name might be lost to the grand histories, the faint, lingering scent of his particular ink, a unique blend of oak galls and iron vitriol, was said to still subtly permeate the alcove, a ghostly signature of his enduring influence. The soft glow of a single, flickering oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the hushed expanse of the Royal Library's secret annex. It was a space quite unlike the grand, gilded hall that presented itself to visiting dignitaries, that public facade of enlightened monarchy. No, this was a room of stark utility, its walls lined not with decorative tomes but with the very sinews of an empire. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper, beeswax, and a faint, metallic tang of ink, seemed to hum with the weight of unshared knowledge, a quiet murmur of forgotten decisions echoing through the stillness. Here, in the deepest quiet of the palace, behind a cleverly disguised panel or perhaps a cleverly placed tapestry whose threads once depicted a pastoral scene but now merely hinted at a hidden doorway, lay the shelves that housed the books the king actually read, not the beautifully bound classics, chosen with an eye towards public impression and intellectual display, but working texts. These were the grimoires of governance, the blueprints of power, military manuals, their pages dog-eared and annotated, engineering treatises filled with complex diagrams and calculations, meticulous reports from far-flung colonial expeditions, their covers stained with the dust of distant lands, and the private journals of trusted commanders, their brittle, almost translucent pages whispering tales of strategy and sacrifice, their ink sometimes faded to a pale sepia. The king, a figure often portrayed in opulent silks and solemn grandeur, would shed a layer of that public persona here. He would become, for these late hours, a scholar of survival, a cartographer of dominion. His fingers, perhaps still bearing the faint indentations of a signet ring, would trace the intricate lines of maps too detailed, too strategically sensitive for any public display. These weren't the comforting, generalized charts found in schoolhouses, but living documents, scarred with pencil marks indicating troop movements, potential enemy strongholds, and the shifting, uncertain borders of influence. The very paper of these maps often felt different, rougher, as if it had absorbed the very grit and uncertainty of the territories it depicted. Beside them lay architectural drawings of fortifications under construction, their precise angles and formidable bulwarks promising protection against unseen threats, their blueprints smelling faintly of charcoal and ambition. And perhaps most revealing were the sheaves of correspondence from explorers, their hurried scripts describing new territories that as yet appeared on no published maps, lands awaiting the king's claim, his flag, his will. It was within these walls, under the watchful, silent gaze of countless unbound pages, that the king studied these materials, preparing for decisions that would, with a single stroke of his quill, commit French resources, human and material, to distant ventures or defensive campaigns that would echo through generations. The secret collection, a trove of strategic intelligence, also embraced the spoils of war and the whispers of espionage. There were captured documents from enemy generals, their boasts and anxieties laid bare for the king's scrutiny, sometimes still bearing the faint scent of foreign tobacco or battlefield smoke. Intelligence summaries meticulously prepared by French agents operating under deep cover across the intricate web of European courts and battlefields, offered a mosaic of rival ambitions and vulnerabilities, their coded sections a silent testament to the dangers faced by their authors. And alongside these, private assessments of foreign military capabilities, detailed breakdowns of troop strengths, naval capacities, and the temperaments of opposing commanders were constantly updated, sometimes with marginalia in a different hand, indicating a swift, urgent amendment. These were not static artifacts but working documents, alive with the king's own handwriting, margin notes questioning assumptions, cross-references directing his attention to corroborating evidence, and countless updates as new information, sometimes whispered in hushed tones from a returning courier, arrived to reshape his understanding of the world. One might even find, tucked between the pages of a report on Austrian troop movements, a small dried flower, a silent, almost poignant reminder of an agent's fleeting moment of pace amidst their perilous work. A distinct section of the annex, often overlooked in its quiet importance, was dedicated to medical texts. These weren't the philosophical musings on the humors of the body, but practical, urgent tomes addressing specific concerns, the insidious nature of colonial diseases, the brutal realities of military hygiene, and the formidable health challenges confronting French settlements in tropical climates. The king, his brow furrowed in concentration, would pore over reports from military surgeons, their grim observations detailing treatments that might, just might, keep armies functioning in hostile environments. He would read correspondence from colonial governors, their pleas and warnings describing epidemics that threatened not just individual lives, but the very fabric of French territorial expansion, entire outposts teetering on the brink of collapse due to an unseen foe. The stark reality these documents presented was a quiet, constant danger, a reminder that even the grandest military might could be undone by a microscopic adversary. It was here, amongst these sombre volumes, that one might occasionally find a small leather-bound book, often referred to as a plague journal, detailing the exact progression of symptoms and remedies, however futile, during past outbreaks, a chilling, almost morbid record of humanity's enduring struggle against the invisible. And finally, the remaining shelves sagged under the weight of technical manuals, guides to artillery deployment, their diagrams illustrating the optimal angles of fire, treatises on naval construction detailing the precise specifications for a new class of warship, and detailed analyses of new military technologies, from improved muskets to experimental siege engines, all scrutinized for the advantage they might provide over traditional enemies. These manuals, often bound in sturdy, unadorned leather, bore the faint aroma of metal and grease, a testament to their practical application. The king studied these with an intensity that belied the late hour, his mind calculating angles, trajectories, and the strategic implications of each new invention. He was not merely ruling an empire, he was meticulously constructing it, piece by measured piece, in the quiet solitude of this secret room, guided by the cold, hard logic of these indispensable texts. Deep within the hushed, labyrinthine heart of the royal quarters, nestled away from the bustling court and the endless whispers of the chandeliers, there existed a room. It was a space without windows, a silent, subterranean world where the sun never touched, and the air always felt cool, still, and faintly metallic. Here, in this cloistered chamber, a solitary figure, a cipher clerk, stood as the silent guardian of France's most delicate secrets. This wasn't merely a room, it was the nerve center of French diplomacy, a place accessible only through a cleverly concealed door, a panel of aged oak, carved to mimic the surrounding wall that slid back with a barely perceptible sigh, revealing a world of intricate mechanisms and whispered responsibilities. The faint scent of beeswax and old paper often hung in the air, a quiet testament to countless hours spent in meticulous labor. Within these walls, the very air seemed to hum with the weight of unseen information, a low, resonant thrum of unspoken truths. The tools of his trade lay meticulously arranged on a heavy, scarred oak desk, gleaming encoding wheels, their brass teeth catching the faint lamplight like tiny, polished jewels, cipher keys small and complex like miniature sculpted puzzles, and thick, leather-bound coded dictionaries, their pages rustling softly with the breath of untold narratives, each word a potential doorway to a hidden meaning. These were the instruments that transformed the raw, volatile essence of statecraft into seemingly innocuous correspondence, a protective shell around truths that could reshape empires, a quiet magic practiced in the heart of the palace. The clerk's vigil was often a nocturnal one, a solitary dance with shadows and secrets, stretching long into the early hours before the city truly awoke. By the gentle, flickering glow of an oil lamp, its flame a warm, trembling heart in the cool darkness, casting long, dancing silhouettes on the rough-hewn stone walls, he would labor through the long hours of the night. His fingers, deft and weary from years of precise, repetitive motion, would turn the encoding wheels, each almost inaudible click a step deeper into the labyrinth of secrecy. Outgoing messages, laden with the ambitions and anxieties of the crown, sometimes even the very fate of a nation, would be meticulously encrypted, their true meaning woven into a tapestry of seemingly random characters. With equal painstaking care, incoming intelligence, often fraught with urgency and the faint smell of distant lands, would be unraveled, its layers peeled back until the core truth lay exposed, like a fragile bloom. The very air in that room would thicken with the silent pressure of his task, a palpable weight pressing down. A single misplaced digit, a moment's lapse in concentration from the clerk, who might have been awake for days, could unravel everything. The consequences were chillingly precise. Military operations years in the making could be fatally compromised, their strategic advantage lost. French agents embedded in hostile territories might be exposed to unimaginable dangers, their lives forfeit, or perhaps most perilously, France's strategic intentions, carefully cultivated and fiercely protected, could be laid bare for enemy powers to exploit, changing the course of history. The rhythm of his work was punctuated by the arrival of diplomatic pouches. These leather satchels, often worn and travel-stained, bearing the dust of distant roads and the salt spray of the sea, would arrive at all hours, their contents a direct conduit to the world beyond the palace walls. They were carried by couriers, a shadowy network of individuals who moved through the bustling marketplaces and quiet country roads, their true identities hidden beneath the guises of merchants, their faces obscured by the broad brims of hats, or disguised as humble pilgrims, their steps echoing with the silent urgency of their mission. Sometimes a pouch would arrive still damp with dew, hinting at an overnight journey, its leather cold to the touch. The messages they bore were often tantalizingly brief. A few lines that once decoded could send ripples through the delicate balance of international alliances, a tremor felt across continents. Reports from French ambassadors, detailing the intricate dance of secret negotiations in far-off courts, intelligence from military attachés offering crucial glimpses into the shifting formations of enemy troop movements, sometimes even sketched onto scraps of paper, and urgent warnings from colonial governors, their dispatches hinting at foreign interference in distant lands, a quiet encroachment on French interests. Each message, a piece of a vast, intricate puzzle, landed softly on the clerk's desk, awaiting his patient, unyielding eye. The encoding process itself was a marvel of methodical precision, a silent, intellectual ballet. The original message, drafted in the elegant, measured cadences of standard diplomatic language, perhaps with a slight tremor in the hand of the foreign minister, would first be transcribed onto a fresh sheet of parchment. Then the true work began. The cipher wheels, those silent, brass guardians of meaning, would be engaged, their interlocking gears turning with a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, substituting symbols for letters according to predetermined, intricate patterns. The final version, a masterstroke of disguise, would emerge as seemingly innocuous commercial correspondence, perhaps a detailed invoice for silks from Lyon or a personal letter between imagined friends, discussing trivial matters of health and weather. Sometimes it would even take the form of academic discourse, a scholarly discussion on ancient texts or astronomical observations, any innocent text that, if intercepted by a curious customs official or an enemy spy, would attract no attention, no suspicion, no probing questions. It was a silent art, turning vital state secrets into the mundane, the forgettable, a ghost within plain sight. Decoding, the reverse of this intricate dance, demanded an equally acute sense of care and intuition, a quiet sensitivity to hidden layers. Incoming messages, those cryptic whispers from afar, often contain not just one but multiple layers of meaning, like an onion of secrets. There was the surface message, the seemingly innocuous text that masked the deeper truth, almost a lullaby to lull the unwary. Then the cipher-protected content, the very heart of the message, waiting to be revealed by the correct key. And then, the most subtle layer, the quiet indicators embedded within the message itself, offering clues about the security of the communication channels. The clerk had to possess an almost preternatural ability to discern when a code, once thought impervious, might have been compromised, a silent alarm ringing in his mind like a faraway bell. He had to recognize when messages, seemingly routine, contained hidden warnings, almost like a faint, unsettling scent in the air, a premonition of danger. And perhaps most challenging of all, he had to perceive when apparently routine correspondence, a mundane exchange of pleasantries, in fact concealed urgent intelligence, a ticking clock hidden beneath the veneer of civility. This delicate balance of decryption and interpretation was a constant, low-level hum of quiet danger, a perpetual tension in the air. It was a curious custom, known only to a select few high-ranking officials, and of course the cipher clerks themselves, that the most sensitive communications, those bearing the weight of military intelligence, the precise figures of financial transactions, or the intensely personal messages exchanged between members of the royal family, never relied on consistent ciphers. For these, a bespoke, ephemeral system was devised for each message, a unique key forged and then seemingly dissolved, never to be reused. The reason was profoundly practical, rooted in the precarious nature of royal power. The private opinions and sentiments of royal family members, if ever made public, could prove an immense embarrassment to the crown, potentially undermining their political positions and fracturing alliances. Consider the political tremors caused in 17th century France when the private correspondence of Queen Anne of Austria was nearly intercepted, revealing sensitive details of her personal life and political leanings. Thus their personal thoughts, no matter how fleeting, were guarded with the same fierce intensity as battle plans, a testament to the fragile interplay between the personal and the political in the grand theatre of statecraft. The fate of nations, it seemed, could hinge on a whispered word, a carefully guarded secret, or the silent, tireless work of a solitary figure in a windowless room, turning wheels by lamplight, forever vigilant in the heart of the night. In the hushed heart of the sprawling royal palace, beyond the gilded antechambers and the polite murmur of official receptions, where tax farmers presented their carefully curated ledgers and financial officials exchanged pleasantries, lay a chamber of quiet, relentless industry. This was not a place for public pronouncements or diplomatic niceties. This was the treasury counting room, the true nerve center of the empire's fiscal health. Here, under the flickering glow of tallow candles that cast long, dancing shadows, trusted clerks toiled through the long hours of the night, their quills scratching softly against parchment. Their task was monumental, to meticulously calculate the true, often brutal, cost of royal policies, to project the elusive streams of revenue from far-flung colonial trade, and to track every expenditure, especially those delicate disbursements that would never, under any circumstances, appear in the published financial records. The air in the counting room was thick with the scent of aged paper, lamp oil, and the faint metallic tang of ink. It operated not unlike a military command center, but instead of maps charting troop movements, its tables were laden with detailed records of income flowing in from every single province, from the sun-drenched vineyards of the south to the windswept fishing villages of the north. Beside these, meticulously prepared expense projections for ongoing campaigns stretched like endless scrolls, alongside a constant, almost obsessive, analysis of the financial implications of every political decision, no matter how small. Quills moved with a practiced rhythm, tallying payments dispatched to distant foreign allies, subsidies sent to colonial governors grappling with the complexities of new worlds, and the often hidden costs of maintaining the intricate, shadowy networks of intelligence that snaked across the whole of Europe. The silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional sigh of a weary clerk, was profound, a testament to the weight of the numbers being tallied. Each stroke of the quill was a small, deliberate act building towards a grand, often brutal, picture of the empire's financial health. These late-night sessions, often stretching until dawn painted the sky with faint hues of grey, held a power that frequently eclipsed the more formal, more performative council meetings. It was here, amidst the rustle of paper and the soft murmur of whispered figures, that policy was forged, more directly and more definitively than in any public forum. When a military commander, emboldened by a recent victory or desperate after a costly defeat, dispatched an urgent request for additional funding to extend a campaign, it was the counting room that provided the cold, hard numbers. The clerks would cross-reference the commander's optimistic estimates with past campaign costs, factoring in variables like troop attrition rates and the fluctuating price of siege equipment, all to present a brutally honest appraisal. When a colonial governor, facing an unforeseen rebellion or a sudden blight, reported unexpected expenses that threatened to unravel an entire venture, it was the counting room's analysis that determined the king's response. They would dissect the governor's pleas, comparing them against established budgets and projected revenues from the affected colony, often uncovering hidden efficiencies or exposing desperate exaggerations. And when foreign diplomats, with their carefully worded proposals and veiled threats, suggested arrangements requiring significant financial commitments, it was the meticulous calculations from this very room that shaped royal decisions, often with a quiet, undeniable finality. A kingdom's future, a treasury's solvency, could hinge on the precise calculation of a loan's interest or the projected cost of a newly proposed alliance. The financial records held within these walls told the empire's real, unvarnished story. They laid bare which colonial ventures, despite the grand pronouncements, were genuinely profitable, and which, despite the glittering promises, were little more than gaping money pits. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, for instance, might appear lavishly profitable on paper, but the counting room's ledgers would quietly reveal the immense, ongoing costs of slave labor, military protection against rival powers, and the constant threat of disease. Conversely, a seemingly barren northern territory might, through careful accounting, be shown to yield consistent, albeit modest, revenue from furs or timber. These records revealed which military investments had yielded strategic advantage, and which had been wasteful, bleeding the treasury dry with little to show for it. The cost of a new fleet, meticulously detailed, could be weighed against its actual impact on trade routes or naval dominance. They illuminated which diplomatic arrangements, often heralded as triumphs, were truly financially sustainable, and which were precarious, built on a foundation of shifting debts and uncertain returns. A treaty celebrated in state banquets might, in the counting room, appear to be an unsustainable drain on resources, while a less glamorous trade agreement could be the silent engine of prosperity. This information, raw and uncompromising, was simply too valuable and indeed too dangerous for public circulation. It was a truth reserved for the inner sanctum, kept in heavy, leather-bound ledgers, often secured with intricate brass clasps, accessible only to the king and his most trusted, most silent advisors. The weight of these volumes, both literal and metaphorical, was immense, each page a testament to the empire's quiet machinations. Within these complex calculations, bound in those formidable volumes, lay the very sinews of the empire. Projections of burgeoning tax revenue from newly acquired or expanding colonial territories were meticulously estimated, often down to the last coin. Clerks would pore over maps, consult reports from newly appointed governors, and even study agricultural yields and population estimates to forecast future income with a sobering accuracy. Estimates of military expenses for various strategic scenarios, from a swift border skirmish to a protracted continental war, were plotted with chilling precision. Every soldier's pay, every cannonball, every sack of grain for the cavalry was accounted for, creating a stark financial roadmap for potential conflict, and detailed analyses of trade patterns, charting the flow of goods and wealth across vast oceans, revealed not only the empire's economic opportunities but also its deep, vulnerable chinks, the delicate balance of imports and exports, the impact of piracy, the rise and fall of commodity prices. All these were meticulously tracked, forming a complex tapestry of global commerce. One particularly curious custom, often whispered about among the new clerks, involved the coin weighers. Before any significant sum of gold or silver left the treasury, 2 designated coin weighers, blindfolded and sworn to secrecy, would individually weigh each coin using separate ancient balances. Only if their independent measurements perfectly matched, down to the minutest fraction of a grain, would the coin be deemed genuine and added to the outgoing payment. It was a painstaking, time-consuming ritual, designed to prevent even the most subtle debasement, a testament to the era's deep-seated fear of financial deception. The quiet clink of the scales, the hushed concentration, added another layer of solemnity to the room's already weighty atmosphere. During particularly challenging periods, when the relentless demands of war strained royal finances to their very breaking point, or when distant colonial rebellions threatened to sever vital revenue sources, the counting room became a place of almost continuous operation. The soft glow of candles never truly extinguished, and the scratching of quills rarely ceased. The air, already thick with the scent of parchment and lamp oil, would grow heavy with the unexpressed anxieties of the clerks. Clerks, their faces pale with fatigue, worked in punishing shifts, each meticulously passing their completed ledgers to the next, striving to maintain an absolutely current, unblinking financial picture. This ceaseless labor was not merely about record-keeping. It was about survival, about providing the Crown with the immediate, accurate data necessary for rapid response to ever-changing, often perilous circumstances. The historical context of such periods, with their constant ebb and flow of empires, meant that financial stability was often the razor's edge between triumph and collapse. The fate of an empire, in those quiet, ink-stained hours, often rested on the careful tally of a few dedicated souls, their silent work shaping the course of history far more profoundly than many boisterous pronouncements from the throne. In a chamber hushed and cool, where the very air, carefully monitored, maintained a precisely calibrated humidity, the royal archivists moved with a quiet reverence. Their soft leather slippers barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through high, narrow windows. They tended to their most intimate collection, a private world meticulously preserved. This was no ordinary repository of statecraft, no grand hall echoing with decrees, but a silent testament to the human heart of an absolute monarchy. Here, the true pulse of power beat not in grand pronouncements carved in stone, but in the delicate rustle of aged paper. These weren't the cold, official missives, stamped with wax and sealed with authority, but personal letters. Each one a whisper, a fleeting thought captured, a fragile secret entrusted to parchment, offering a glimpse into the private vulnerabilities and quiet anxieties that even the most powerful could not escape. It was said that the ink on some of these letters, particularly those penned in the deep hours of the night, sometimes still held the faintest scent of lavender or burnt lamp oil. Deep within the hushed stone heart of the palace, just beyond the king's private chambers, lay a space not for gilded display or ceremonial pomp, but for the quiet, ceaseless hum of applied intellect. This was the sanctuary of the royal engineer, a place where the very sinews of the empire were drawn, measured, and meticulously planned. The air here was a subtle blend of old parchment, fine sawdust, and the faint, metallic scent of newly worked brass, the particular perfume of serious work, a scent that clung to the engineer's sleeves like a second skin. One could almost hear the rustle of forgotten plans, the whisper of centuries of imperial ambition echoing in the quiet. This wasn't a room for idle contemplation. It was a workshop, a laboratory of defense and expansion. Tools lay in organized disarray, delicate calipers and heavy compasses rested beside rolls of vellum, their edges curled with frequent handling, bearing the faint imprints of forgotten thumbs. A faint sheen of graphite dust often coated the broad oak tables, testament to countless hours spent leaning over plans, a flickering oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows in the late hours. Here, the king's personal engineer, a figure of quiet, formidable brilliance, translated grand imperial ambitions into the concrete realities of stone, timber, and strategic advantage. He was a silent architect of power, his mind a vast landscape of angles and stresses, his hands capable of rendering the most abstract concept into a tangible blueprint. Across the expansive tables, a silent miniature empire stretched out. These were the scale models, crafted with astonishing precision, depicting the living, breathing state of fortress construction along distant, disputed frontiers. One could trace the nascent lines of a formidable star fort rising from a verdant plain, its bastions still unformed. In the hushed depths of the palace, where shadows stretched long and secrets whispered through ancient stone, a small, unassuming chamber held the nerve center of royal security. This was the night watch captain's station, a room perched with a discreet view over the private courtyard, its windows like watchful eyes over the approaches to the royal quarters. It wasn't a place for ceremonial pomp, no gleaming armor or idle parade here. Instead, it hummed with the quiet intensity of practical intelligence work, a constant, almost imperceptible surveillance of who approached, when sensitive meetings unfolded, and whether the intricate dance of security protocols was being flawlessly executed. The air in this chamber often carried the faint scent of old parchment and lamp oil, a testament to the captain's tireless vigil, a slow, smoky aroma that clung to the heavy tapestries and the well-worn wooden desk. The captain, a figure often overlooked by day, truly came alive with the setting sun. His hands, though perhaps calloused from a lifetime of duty, moved with a surprising delicacy as he maintained meticulous logs of nighttime activities. These weren't mere jottings, they were chronicles of the palace's nocturnal heartbeat. Each entry detailed which ministers arrived for clandestine conferences, their faces often etched with concern in the flickering torchlight, or when diplomatic couriers, their breath still ragged from their journey, delivered urgent messages, their sealed dispatches holding the fate of nations. He noted the subtle patterns of activity, the predictable comings and goings that signaled normal operations, contrasted with the slightest deviation that might hint at a potential security concern. These records, bound in leather and smelling faintly of beeswax, were not simply filed away. They were revisited weekly, their contents scrutinized again and again, like a forgotten dream trying to reveal its meaning, all to identify vulnerabilities in the palace's protective shell, and to ensure that sensitive meetings remained shrouded in absolute confidence. The rustle of turning pages, the soft scratch of a quill on paper, these were the sounds of his vigilant nights, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl or the faint clang of a guard's armor in the courtyard below. The security arrangements for the private quarters were in truth far more intricate than any public ceremony dared to suggest. What the populace saw was but the outermost layer of a carefully constructed edifice. Within, multiple layers of guards, each with their own specific duties and clearances, controlled access to different areas. There were special protocols for handling diplomatic messengers, whose hurried footsteps often heralded momentous news, and for colonial officials, their faces often tanned by distant suns, whose presence could stir political currents. Even more delicate were the arrangements for foreign visitors, whose very presence, if publicly known, could ignite a diplomatic firestorm. These were the ghosts of the palace, moving through hidden passages and secret stairwells, their existence known only to a select few. The captain's quiet pride lay in maintaining this complex ballet of secrecy, ensuring that the palace's inner workings remained impenetrable. He understood that a well-guarded secret was like a carefully woven tapestry. One loose thread could unravel the whole design. Beyond the immediate confines of the palace walls, the captain's reach extended surprisingly far. He coordinated with his counterparts at other royal residences, a silent network of watchful eyes across the realm. He maintained regular communication with intelligence officers stationed in major cities, their reports often arriving by swift courier or coded message, detailing whispers and rumors from the furthest corners of the kingdom. And then there was his network of informants, a shadowy web of individuals whose loyalty was often bought with a careful balance of coin and quiet influence. These informants reported on activities in areas where potential threats to royal security might silently develop, their observations often the first tremor of an impending danger. The captain's work was, at its heart, preventive. It was about identifying problems long before they blossomed into full-blown crises, like a silent gardener tending to a dangerous weed before it could take root. He knew that the softest rustle in the leaves could herald a coming storm. During periods of international tension, the security station transformed. What was usually a quiet office became a small, bustling intelligence center. Reports flowed in from agents monitoring foreign diplomatic activities, their coded messages often describing the subtle shifts in alliances or the quiet mobilization of distant armies. The movements of potentially hostile individuals were meticulously tracked, their itineraries scrutinized for any deviation from the expected. And then protective measures were coordinated, a silent symphony of security designed to allow the king to maintain his public schedule, to appear outwardly unconcerned, all while remaining shielded from a myriad of unseen threats. It was a delicate act of deception, a necessary illusion to preserve stability. The faint clatter of abacus beads, the quiet murmur of whispered commands, the frantic scratching of pens on fresh parchment, these sounds replaced the usual nocturnal calm, turning the chamber into a strategic hub, a quiet storm of information. Historians often overlook these hidden bastions of power, focusing instead on the grand pronouncements and public spectacles, yet it was often in such unassuming rooms that the true pulse of an empire beat. The night shift reports, penned by the captain himself in a neat, concise hand, often contained information far too sensitive for formal intelligence summaries. They held observations about the reliability of court officials, their true allegiances often revealed under the quiet pressure of the late hours. There were assessments of foreign visitors' real intentions, often gleaned from subtle tells in their demeanor or unguarded remarks. And most crucially, these reports contained warnings about potential security compromises that demanded immediate attention from the royal security advisors, sometimes even before the morning light could fully illuminate the palace grounds. One such report, tucked away in a forgotten archive, detailed a peculiar recurring dream shared by several lower-ranking guards, a dream of a black cat with eyes like burning embers, appearing always at the same unholy hour near the Queen's private garden. The captain had noted it with a quiet unease, an unresolved question hanging in the air, a whisper of something beyond the realm of ordinary threats. The guards, normally stoic and practical men, had described the dream with a chilling uniformity in their hushed voices, a detail that had prickled at the captain's seasoned intuition. Why a cat? Why always the Queen's garden? The mystery, like a shadow in the corner of the room, remained unsolved, a quiet danger lurking at the edge of the known. Beyond the grand, echoing spaces of the formal chapel, where the rustle of silk and the murmur of prayer mingled in a public spectacle of faith, lay a hushed, unassuming room. This was the private chapel's preparation chamber, a place not for display but for a quiet, solitary communion. It offered the monarch a rare respite from the ever-present gaze of the court. Here the air was still, thick with the scent of aged parchment and a faint, lingering aroma of beeswax from the simple, unadorned candles. The furnishings were sparse, a sturdy, unpolished wooden prie-dieu, its worn surface smoothed beneath the monarch's hands, a small table, perhaps a single high-backed chair, its leather creaking softly with age. Practicality, not pomp, dictated its design. The light, often cast by those same flickering candles or a single leaded glass window, its panes subtly distorting the outside world, was designed for reading, for introspection, not for illuminating an audience. The religious texts here were not gilded showpieces but well-worn companions, their pages softened by countless turns, their margins perhaps filled with the king's own illegible annotations, a silent testament to a faith sought for guidance, not for public impression. The very dust motes dancing in the faint light seemed to hold ancient secrets, undisturbed by the hurried pace of court life. Within these quiet walls, the king's private correspondence with his most trusted religious advisers often unfolded. These were not the formal, carefully worded pronouncements destined for the public record, but intimate confessions, raw and searching. The quill would scratch softly across the vellum, a whisper of ink on paper, articulating the thorny moral questions that colonial policies inevitably spawned: the ethics of acquisition, the treatment of indigenous populations, the very justification of empire under a benevolent god. The ink, perhaps a deep sepia, would dry slowly, each letter a tangible manifestation of a monarch's inner turmoil. There were equally weighty ethical considerations surrounding ongoing military campaigns, the cost of conquest in human lives, the justice of the cause, the burden of command, a burden that weighed heavily on a soul tasked with sending young men to their deaths, and of course the deeply personal decisions that for a monarch invariably carried profound political implications, sometimes involving matters of succession, marriage, or even the very fabric of the realm. Each letter, carefully folded and sealed with the royal cipher, a wax impression of authority, represented a whispered plea for wisdom, a grappling with conscience in the lonely crucible of power. One could almost hear the rustle of the paper, the sigh of a king burdened by the unseen weight of his decisions. The books that lined the simple shelves of this preparation chamber were not for casual perusal. They were working books, tools for intellectual and spiritual labor. Here rested weighty theological treatises exploring the moral responsibilities that lay upon the shoulders of a ruler, the divine right to govern, yes, but also the divine obligation to govern justly, mercifully. These tomes, often bound in sturdy leather, spoke of kingship as a sacred trust, a stewardship rather than an absolute dominion. Alongside these scholarly works were devotional writings, their words crafted to address the unique spiritual challenges faced by those burdened with political leadership. These were texts that spoke to the isolation, the temptations, the constant pressure to compromise, offering solace and fortitude like a quiet companion in the small hours of the night. And then tucked amongst them might be the carefully preserved private communications from trusted clergy, those rare individuals who truly understood the intricate, often agonizing intersection between personal faith and the harsh practicalities of political necessity. It was a strange custom, perhaps, that the spiritual health of an entire realm could, in some measure, rest on the private correspondence between a king and a few chosen advisers, their words exchanged in the quiet sanctity of this small room. This silent exchange, unseen by the public eye, held a disproportionate power, shaping destinies with whispered counsel. It was in this very chamber that late-night devotions often unfolded, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls just before major political decisions were unveiled to the court the following morning. The air would grow cool, a faint chill that seeped in from the stone walls, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the small hearth or the distant hoot of an owl echoing in the quiet night. Here the king would kneel, the rough wood of the prie-dieu pressing into his knees, seeking spiritual counsel on policies that held the fate of thousands, perhaps millions, of lives in their balance. He would pray for guidance on the moral dimensions of delicate international negotiations, where a misplaced word or a hardened stance could plunge nations into conflict, shattering the fragile peace of Europe. And most importantly, he would engage in profound personal reflection on the ethical implications of exercising absolute power, a power that, in its very nature, could corrupt even the most well-intentioned heart, a silent menace lurking in the grand corridors of power. The weight of such decisions, made in the hushed glow of a candle, must have been immense, a silent struggle between the demands of the crown and the dictates of the soul, a battle fought in the quiet theatre of his own conscience. This private religious observance, shielded from the pageantry and posturing of court life, created a vital space. It was a sanctuary for acknowledging the human cost of political decisions, for confronting the stark reality that every edict, every treaty, every declaration bore a tangible impact on individuals, on families, on entire communities. It was where the monarch sought spiritual strength for the inevitably difficult choices that lay ahead, choices that few others could truly comprehend, for how many truly understood the burden of an empire? And critically, it served as an anchor, a means of maintaining personal moral grounding amidst the relentless, often morally compromising practical demands of ruling a global empire. Without this quiet refuge, one might wonder how any ruler could navigate such treacherous waters without losing their way entirely, without succumbing to the siren call of absolute, unchecked power. This chamber was more than just a room. It was a psychological and spiritual bulwark against the erosion of the monarch's moral compass. The chamber's simplicity, its stark absence of adornment, stood in sharp contrast to the opulent, elaborate public ceremonies conducted in the main chapel. That grand space with its soaring arches and glittering altars was for display, for projecting an image of divine sanction and unwavering authority to a kneeling populace. This small, unassuming room, however, reflected something far more intimate: the profound difference between ceremonial display and genuine personal spiritual practice, between the performance of religious duty and the raw, vulnerable authenticity of a private devotional life. It was a space where the king was, for a brief time, simply a man grappling with the weight of his soul and the immense burden of his office, a man seeking answers in the quiet, flickering light of a candle. The whispers of his prayers, unheard by any save perhaps a watchful angel, held more truth than any public proclamation. In a chamber hushed by the thick stone walls and the velvet draperies that swallowed sound, a space purposefully designed with a northern exposure to grant it that consistent, unwavering light, a cool, diffused glow that wouldn't shift with the sun's demanding arc, ensuring colors remained true and shadows never danced misleadingly across a vital line. The royal cartographer toiled. It was often through the long, quiet hours of the night that their most intricate work unfolded. The only sounds the soft scratch of a quill, the rustle of vellum, and perhaps the distant hoot of an owl. This was no ordinary map room, filled with gilded decorative charts meant for public display or the casual admiration of visiting dignitaries. No, these were the pulsing, living documents of French territorial control, constantly being revised, scratched out, and re-inked to reflect the ever-shifting sands of empire. One could almost feel the weight of nations in the air. Each map was a strategic tapestry, woven with the threads of power and ambition. They depicted not just static borders but the dynamic ebb and flow of military positions, the recent hard-won territorial acquisitions that often came at a staggering human cost, and those frustrating, often bloody areas where control remained stubbornly contested, simmering with unrest just beneath the surface. The air, even in the dead of night, held the faint, metallic tang of ink, often gall ink, rich and deep, and the dry, papery scent of parchment, sometimes mingled with the faint aroma of beeswax used to seal dispatches, a silent testament to countless hours spent hunched over these vital documents, their surfaces smoothed by the touch of diligent hands. New information, like whispers carried on the wind, arrived ceaselessly, sometimes damp from a long journey through rain, sometimes crisp and brittle from desert heat. It came in official dispatches sealed with the crests of distant colonial governors, their seals often intricate and unique, requiring careful authentication. It came in terse, coded messages from military commanders on far-flung frontiers, sometimes scrawled hastily on whatever paper was available, its urgency palpable. And in the breathless, often exaggerated, accounts of explorers venturing into uncharted wildernesses, their narratives filled with both wonder and peril. These reports spoke of tantalizing territorial discoveries, of whispered intelligence regarding enemy military positions, their strengths, their weaknesses, their suspected movements often gleaned from spies or captured documents. Then there were the meticulous surveys of land, painstakingly conducted, assessing their suitability for French settlement, for the establishment of a new trading post, or more ominously, for a strategic military base. The cartographer, with a practiced hand and a mind like a steel trap, absorbed every detail, every nuance, incorporating this fresh data into the master maps. These weren't merely drawings. They were living, breathing portraits of French strategic reality, providing an accurate, if sometimes brutally honest, picture of their global reach, a reality that often meant expansion at the expense of others. The studio, a sanctuary of precision, housed a veritable library of map series, each serving a distinct critical purpose. There were the exquisitely detailed surveys of European frontiers, where every hillock, every river bend, every village, every solitary farmhouse was meticulously recorded, overlaid with the current, often fleeting, positions of military units, their movements tracked like chess pieces on a grand board. Then came the comprehensive charts of colonial territories, vast swaths of land rendered in intricate detail, indicating the precise, often tenuous extent of French control from the snow-laden forests of Canada to the sun-baked shores of distant islands. And finally, the strategic maps, the most guarded of all, which highlighted key defensive positions, potential avenues for expansion, and the perilous routes that supply lines might take, often marked with small, colored pins that could be rearranged as quickly as circumstances changed. The technical work demanded an almost superhuman level of precision, a steady hand that could draw a hairline border without tremor, and an even steadier nerve, for one misplaced line could spell disaster for an entire campaign. But beyond the technical skill, it required an absolute, unwavering discretion. These were not maps to be idly glanced at, nor were they ever left unattended. The military maps, for instance, laid bare the locations of French fortifications, the precise deployments of Allied forces, and perhaps most critically, the carefully assessed defensive capabilities of their adversaries. This was information that, if it ever fell into the wrong hands, if it somehow reached hostile powers, could compromise French strategic positions in a heartbeat, leading to devastating consequences, the loss of lives, and the erosion of empire. Colonial mapping in its own way was equally sensitive, perhaps even more so in its implications for the future. These charts unveiled the true, often brutal extent of French territorial control, pinpointing the locations of valuable resources, gold, timber, furs, spices that fueled the empire's coffers and drove the relentless engine of European expansion. They also contained assessments, often chillingly detached, of indigenous populations, their numbers, their tribal loyalties, their potential to either support or, more dangerously, to oppose French expansion efforts. This information, though essential for shaping policy decisions and guiding the empire's relentless march, was far too valuable, far too potent to risk through public circulation. It remained locked away, accessible only to the highest echelons of power, guarded not just by locks and keys, but by an unspoken understanding of its immense power. The cartographer, in their quiet vigil, maintained a vast and intricate web of correspondence. Letters, often coded and sealed with multiple layers of wax, bearing the impressions of various signets, flowed back and forth between them, and a network of surveyors, explorers, and military engineers scattered across the vast expanse of the empire. This ceaseless exchange was crucial, coordinating information-gathering efforts, clarifying discrepancies that might arise from different surveying methods or conflicting reports, and ensuring that the strategic maps, the very bedrock of French power, reflected current realities rather than outdated assumptions about territorial control and military positions that, in the fast-paced world of imperial expansion, could change overnight. It was rumored that one particular cartographer, during the reign of Louis Roman XIV, developed a unique cipher based on the star charts of the night sky, believing that only the celestial bodies offered a truly unchangeable reference for the secrets they exchanged. During periods of active military campaigns, when the drumbeat of war echoed across continents, the studio transformed. It operated continuously, a low hum of activity permeating the quiet, the air growing thick with the scent of lamp oil and the faint aroma of stale coffee. Multiple shifts of clerks, their faces pale in the lamplight, worked tirelessly alongside the cartographer, updating troop positions with each incoming dispatch, meticulously charting territorial changes as they were reported, and refining strategic assessments. This relentless, almost obsessive dedication to detail allowed royal commanders, often hundreds or thousands of miles away, to make informed decisions about resource allocation, to gauge the true cost of victory, and to prioritize military objectives with a chillingly precise understanding of the battlefield. One might wonder, gazing at the intricate lines and shaded regions, if any of those who drew these maps ever truly slept, or if the very act of charting the world kept them in a perpetual state of wakefulness, burdened by the immense responsibility of empire and the silent knowledge of the lives these lines represented. In the soft glow of candlelight, a hush fell over the antechamber, not far from the king's own private rooms, where the rustle of treaties and the murmur of advisers often carried late into the night. The queen maintained her own world of influence. It was a space of quiet power, a realm woven from silk and parchment, overseen by a trusted secretary. This individual, often a woman of noble birth but always of keen intellect, was the silent architect of the queen's subtler political maneuvers. Their role was to manage a flow of correspondence, a delicate dance of words too intimate, too laden with nuance, for the heavily inked official channels of state. The air in these rooms, even late at night, often held the faint, comforting scent of beeswax from the candles, mingled with the dry, earthy aroma of old paper and the subtle sweetness of fading potpourri. The queen's position, by all outward appearances, was largely ceremonial. She graced state dinners, presided over court functions, and offered a regal presence. Yet beneath this gilded surface, her influence hummed like a hidden loom, its shuttles moving through threads unseen by most. It operated through the intricate threads of family connections, the intimate whispers of personal relationships, and the subtle currents of informal diplomatic channels. The secretary was the keeper of these threads, ensuring they remained taut and purposeful, never snapping under the weight of statecraft. Imagine the gentle scratching of a quill on fine vellum, the rhythmic sound a quiet counterpoint to the distant chiming of a palace clock. The secretary's days were filled with the careful crafting and deciphering of letters exchanged with the Queen's family members scattered across the glittering courts of Europe. These weren't mere greetings, they were vital arteries of information, pulsating with the lifeblood of dynastic power. They maintained relationships that could, at a moment's notice, become invaluable conduits for intelligence or unexpected diplomatic opportunities. The letters themselves were a fascinating blend, personal in tone, yet deeply political in their undertones. A mention of a cousin's fading health could, for the discerning eye, reveal a shift in a foreign line of succession, perhaps opening a window for French influence. A casual observation about a duke's new mistress might hint at a court's moral compass or a potential vulnerability, a weakness to be noted and perhaps one day exploited. What appeared as mere family news often unveiled the intricate dynamics of a foreign court, while personal opinions, carefully couched in polite formalities, could signal emerging political directions. Even social observations, seemingly trivial, a new fashion trend in Vienna, a scandalous affair in Madrid, were sifted for valuable intelligence about foreign intentions, like divining a coming storm from the behavior of distant clouds, the faintest change in the air hinting at larger shifts. The Queen's private charitable activities, though seemingly altruistic, also required a deft hand to navigate the treacherous waters of political complication. The secretary meticulously managed donations to religious institutions, ensuring that patronage did not inadvertently favor a rival faction or alienate a crucial ally. A donation to a convent in one province might subtly counter the growing influence of a Protestant sect in a neighboring region, a quiet move on the grand chessboard of faith and power. They coordinated support for specific families, often those affected by the brutal realities of military campaigns, a gesture of compassion that simultaneously built loyalty and garnered goodwill, sowing seeds of allegiance in devastated territories. And then there was patronage, the quiet support of artistic projects. A painter commissioned for a portrait, a musician sponsored to compose a new opera, a new wing for a library filled with precious manuscripts. These initiatives enhanced French cultural prestige, burnishing the nation's image without ever creating a ripple of diplomatic discord. It was a subtle art, this cultivation of soft power, where beauty and benevolence served the state, often more effectively than any declaration of war. Perhaps the most sensitive of all correspondences were those concerning marriage negotiations for royal family members. These were communications demanding absolute discretion, whispered promises and tentative arrangements that could reshape the map of Europe, drawing new borders with the stroke of a pen and the exchange of vows. The secretary became a silent confidante, managing the flow of letters about potential alliances, the careful preliminary discussions surrounding dowries, and the intricate territorial arrangements that often accompanied such unions. And most crucially, they handled the private assessments of foreign royal families, a prince's temperament, a princess's intellect, a dowager queen's influence, all gleaned from discreet inquiries and carefully worded reports. These intimate details, pieced together, could subtly influence French diplomatic strategies for generations to come. It said that one particular secretary, during the reign of Louis Roman XIV, developed a coded system using specific flower descriptions in her letters to indicate the temperament of potential brides: a white lily for purity and gentleness, a thorny rose for a more challenging personality, perhaps even a wilting violet for a delicate constitution. This quiet floral language, understood only by a select few, ensured delicate matters remained truly private, a secret garden of information. Even the Queen's personal religious activities, deeply felt as they often were, carried political implications that required careful management. Her correspondence with spiritual advisors, her unwavering support for specific charitable institutions with religious affiliations, and her patronage of religious art projects: a new altarpiece for a favored chapel, a stained glass window depicting a saint important to her family, all had to be meticulously balanced. They were weighed against larger diplomatic considerations, ensuring they didn't offend a Protestant ally or inadvertently fuel a domestic religious dispute, and against the ever-present sensitivities of domestic politics. A queen's piety could be a powerful tool, but one that needed to be wielded with profound care, lest it spark unintended fires. Finally, there was the vast ocean of social correspondence. These letters, seemingly innocuous, were a rich vein of information valuable for state purposes. They contained observations about foreign court officials, a minister's penchant for gambling, an ambassador's flirtatious nature that offered insights into their character and potential vulnerabilities, quiet levers that could be pulled if necessary. They provided assessments of international social dynamics, understanding how a particular fashion trend or a shift in societal etiquette in one court might subtly affect diplomatic relationships, influencing perceptions and expectations. And most importantly, they gathered intelligence through informal channels, the casual gossip and whispered confidences that often complemented and sometimes even contradicted the formal diplomatic reporting. It was in these unassuming missives that the true pulse of Europe could sometimes be felt, a quiet hum beneath the grand pronouncements of kings, a gentle tremor that often heralded seismic shifts. Deep within the silent heart of the palace, beyond the gilded salons and the echoing marble halls, lay a secure chamber. It was a place known only to the king and his most trusted private secretary, a sanctuary of secrets, a quiet vault where the true unvarnished ambitions of the crown were laid bare. Here in the archive of unfinished business, files accumulated, each sheet of parchment a testament to policies proposed, considered, but ultimately never brought to fruition. The air within this room, even in our imagining, feels thick with the dust of forgotten intentions, the faint scent of old paper and beeswax, and the lingering presence of royal aspirations. These documents, carefully bound and meticulously categorized, revealed the true scope of royal ambitions, the often harsh practical constraints that limited action, and the intricate strategic thinking that shaped decisions about resource allocation and the delicate dance of political priorities. One might notice upon closer inspection that each bound volume of proposals bears a unique, almost cryptic sigil impressed into its leather cover, a small, faded symbol that, to the uninitiated, means nothing, but to the king and his secretary, denotes the original proponent of that particular, ultimately shelved, grand design. Among these venerable files, one would find the ghosts of unfinished military campaigns. There were detailed plans for territorial expansion, grand visions of extending the kingdom's reach, now shelved, their edges softened by the passage of time, thwarted by the cold reality of financial limitations. Perhaps a map brittle with age depicting a grand sweep of cavalry across a disputed border, now merely a faded ink drawing. Beside these lay meticulous strategic assessments, sober analyses that, with quiet authority, recommended caution rather than aggressive action, urging restraint when the impulse was to conquer. And then there were the evaluations of military commanders, blunt, often unflattering, judgments of capabilities deemed insufficient for the proposed ambitious operations. Imagine a marginal note in the king's own hand, a single decisive stroke through a general's name, sealing their fate not in battle, but in the quiet annals of unrealized glory. Each map, each strategy, each assessment, a whisper of what might have been, a quiet acknowledgement of power's limits. Further still, filling other compartments within this hushed archive, were the dreams of colonial development projects. Here resided elaborate blueprints for new settlements, sprawling visions of burgeoning towns and fertile lands, all postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen international complications, a distant treaty, a shifting alliance, a whispered threat from a neighboring power. The faint smell of sea salt might cling to some of these documents, remnants of ambitious maritime ventures. Economic development schemes, too, lay dormant, grand designs for prosperity that simply demanded more resources than the treasury, however vast, could provide. And territorial expansion proposals, bold and daring in their conception, were ultimately deemed too risky, too volatile, given the current, precarious political circumstances of the era.